In April 2011, here in Nottingham, Jackie Bartlam was brutally attacked and murdered by her own son, Daniel, in their family home. He was just 14 years old. After bludgeoning Jackie to death with a hammer, Daniel set her body alight. He had fantasized about killing her for months. He'd plotted, planned, and scripted his own mum's death. I've been working with children for over 25 years, and in that time, I've been invited into hundreds of family homes around the world. I understand the complex human nature of children, their behaviour and healthy, functional family life. And for me, the words evil and children just don't sit well together. How can someone so young commit, follow through, and execute such a monstrous act? And in this case, what motivates a young boy to murder his own mother?
The first time I saw Daniel Bartlam in the dock at Nottingham Crown Court, I was surprised at how young he looked. He didn't look 14 years old. He looked maybe 11 or 12. And for the first time as a journalist, I found out what exactly this boy was charged with and what he'd done. It was shocking. It was absolutely tragic to think that a boy of that age could dream up such a plan, put it into action, and then leave the house and pretend that he was the hero that had led the family dog to safety and his young brother. Unfortunately, his mother had been left in the house and had perished.
In 2012, Daniel Bartlam was sentenced to 16 years in prison for murdering his own mother. The press were quick to brand the youngster a devil child.
To find out that Daniel planned to kill his own mother and then hear all the details, it is also hard to believe. The most difficult part for us, and something that only Daniel can answer, is why.
In my many years working with kids, I've seen some troubling examples of family life. Cases of parents abusing children, neglect, and at times, for sure, teenagers pushing the boundaries. Thankfully, I've never encountered a family where I actually feared for the life of a parent. Jackie Bartlam's partner, Simon Matters, was away for the Easter weekend. By the time he returned, the bottom had fallen out of his world. Can you take me back?
I'd spoken to Jackie on the morning, so it was Easter Sunday. We had a text, you okay sort of thing. Yeah, I think she told me Daniel was going out with the grandparents or something, so nothing out of the ordinary. Next morning, there was a news report there'd been a fire in Nottingham, in Arnold, and that's all I got. That's all I knew. And then sort of maybe an hour later, it confirmed that there'd been a fire on this particular road where she lived. And I didn't know at that point, but I knew straight away it was her house. I don't know why. Still don't know to this day why, but I knew it was her house. Straight away I thought Daniel.
Daniel was born on November the 11th, 1996. His mum Jackie and father Adrian got married when he was 3. He grew up in a nice detached house, in middle-class surroundings, and attended the local private school. But soon after the birth of his younger brother, 9-year-old Daniel had to deal with the split of his parents and began to display anything but typical behaviour.
Daniel's an interesting character. What we'd normally expect in such a violent incident from a child or a teenager is a history of abuse and neglect in his background, and that apparently is absent. And it seems that the only thing that seemed to have traumatised him was the divorce of his parents. Divorcing parents are preoccupied with their own needs. They have financial needs, they have social needs, they're looking for perhaps solace in a new partner or in friends. And what they're not available for is the children.
Jackie met Simon on a night out in May 2008.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't go out planning to meet somebody or anything like that. I mean, I'd been split up for quite some time. And yeah, it was comforting to know somebody was there, absolutely. I think with Jackie, it was just the way she cared for everybody. She showed a genuine interest in people.
Yeah.
I think I found that quite attractive.
Jackie's divorce had financial implications on the Bartlam family, and it was Daniel who it seemed to affect the most.
He went from a good private school to a state school. Now, that's not a bad thing in itself, but the state school children would have probably picked on him for that, and he may have been bullied, teased about his previous school, and not found his new school environment very pleasant.
He was told he had to come out of the private school and go to a mainstream school. And it was at that point that we started discussing about moving in together.
Right, yeah.
To sell my house and sell her house and to pool resources to buy a house.
Yeah.
But it was at that point that Daniel started playing up.
Right.
And that's when it started becoming apparent there was a few issues.
So why didn't that actually happen? The actual moving in, if you were planning on doing it.
We found a number of houses that we wanted, but we couldn't find the house that was agreeable to Daniel.
To Daniel?
To Daniel. That wasn't my decision, but Jackie's decision.
How did you feel about that?
Well, I felt at that point that it was Daniel calling the shots.
Yeah.
Rather than deciding where to live, moving in and then making the most of... Because obviously Jackie wouldn't have put him in any old school just for the sake of it. She would have found the best school for him.
What did he say to her that would make her go, no? I mean, obviously
he was constantly saying that he didn't want to leave the private school. And he was constantly saying that it's sort of, I can't go to a comprehensive school or whatever because he just it was below him really.
One thing is for sure, Daniel was having to deal with a lot of external and emotional changes. He was no longer an only child. He now had to find his place in an unfamiliar family dynamic as an older sibling. Could a new younger brother and a new partner to compete with for his mother's attention have left him feeling unloved, pushed out even?
So what effect would that have had on Daniel?
I think that the time prior to the divorce, Daniel feels like he's got quite a lot of control over what's going on in his life. He knows where he is, he knows that this is where I go to school, this is where I live, everything is hunky-dory. And then afterwards, all of these changes are happening that are basically not brought about by him, but he feels they are happening to him. He is very egocentric. And I think it is that realisation that I don't have power, I don't have control over this family unit now. Things are happening to me.
Well, we know that the brain is incredibly plastic and is changing all the time. If you learn to play the piano, it changes your brain completely. So everything changes your brain, everything you experience. Adolescence is a time of enormous rejigging of the brain. But it has to be said that hundreds and hundreds of children live through their parents' divorce. They don't kill anybody. So those things in themselves don't change the brain in a way that causes somebody to kill.
Alone and frustrated, Daniel hid himself away from the world.
The impact of those things, being unhappy at school, unhappy at home, meant he became reclusive. And where all children explore things that are banned for them, such as 18 movies or horror movies. What children normally do is they control themselves socially by comparing notes with each other at school. But if you're socially isolated and a recluse, you go into a fantasy world.
So you can see that the material that he was exposed to wasn't the material that a 14-year-old boy should be exposed to, but that's what was going on secretly in Daniel Bartlam's bedroom.
Now, in Daniel's case, he became more and more angry with the lack of attention he was getting from his parents. And unfortunately, his anger seemed to build up with the parent that he was living with most, which is his mother. And then at some point, he began to be influenced by the media to plan her harm.
And eventually, Daniel was ready to snap.
He made a decision at some point that it wasn't only going to harm his mother, he was going to actually kill his mother.
By the age of 14, Daniel Bartlam had no social life, spending hours alone, obsessively watching violent horror movies. But what led him to graduate from being a lonely, troubled youngster into a teenager capable of killing his own mother?
There's one occasion that I can't remember what had started it, but Daniel had started shouting at Jackie.
Yeah.
And he'd got right up to her face, literally nose to nose, and that was the first time I'd had to step in, and I literally stood him. I had to prise him away from her, and I literally, I actually did tell him, you better go out of the way quick. I didn't threaten him, but I was getting angry because of what he was doing, and he ran upstairs, and for about what seemed like 2 or 3 minutes, he was kicking the banisters, hitting the wall, swearing and shouting. Effing this, effing that, but eventually he went into his room, slammed his door, and that was it.
How was Jackie?
Shaking, absolutely, visibly shaking.
Scared?
I think so, yeah. Had I not been there, don't know what would have happened.
Did he do things? Did he do house chores?
No.
Was he a responsible boy?
No, he's just selfish.
A lot of people look at it and look at the bare bones, the facts of it, and say, can't you see what was going on here? And actually, when you look at some psychopathic behaviours, they are very consistent with teenage behaviours. Failure to take responsibility for your own actions, lack of remorse, lack of empathy. So it's very difficult to distinguish when you've got a personality disorder on your hands versus a normal teenager.
How many parents have their children up in the bedrooms? There's no communal computer downstairs, let alone the lack of parental guidance and true understanding of how this can shape and influence young children today.
I think it often serves parents' short-term needs, doesn't it? I'm knackered, I've just got home from work, I've got to get the dinner on. Oh, he's going to go play upstairs on his video games, or he's going to go just spend some time in his room. But if that goes on for hours and hours and hours, and the kind of content that the child is consuming is this extreme and this violent, that's a recipe for disaster.
It sounds like he spent a lot of time up there.
Yeah, he did, yeah.
Eat up in his room?
Yeah.
Video games up in his room?
Yeah.
Evening times up in the room?
Yeah, very rarely came down, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Particularly towards the end when he got a bit older. Basically, nobody knew what he was doing in his room.
Right.
Everybody presumed that he was doing his computer stuff. He used to mend laptops at 12 years old. Fix laptops for friends, get old broken laptops and fix them, and make videos and put stuff on YouTube, watch DVDs and
What sort of stuff was he watching?
horror movies. For a child of 11, 12, they're pretty gruesome.
Daniel's browser history was discovered after the murder. It contained some shocking searches.
So when the police started looking more closely at Daniel and what Daniel was up to, they found that he had a rather unhealthy sort of interest in some pretty strange things, like murder. He'd been writing some pretty sort of disturbing, far-fetched, creative stories.
Some of the stories that you'd bring downstairs about kids killing each other and fighting on the way to school, and draw pictures of people stabbing each other and blood dripping, just things which at the time you think, oh, kids, but looking back on it now, it's all not right,
No alarm bells going off then?
This was like a year and a half before he did what he did. But then again, at the end of the day, if he's watching horror movies, some kids are going to write stories about them, aren't they? They're going to sort of match the two up. But that doesn't mean that you're going to then commit a murder later on.
That's the one thing that really stands out for me in this case, is that Daniel has gone from consuming violent media to actually creating it, producing it himself. And when you have somebody that does that, that makes real violence all the more possible, because it's a series of steps, isn't it? From thinking to doing.
Correct.
And he's on that path now.
The extraordinary thing for me about Daniel's case is that in the end, it wasn't just horror movies and violent video games that inspired his murderous plans. In fact, it was a seemingly harmless primetime soap opera.
He'd already decided that he hated his mother, that he wanted his mother dead. He'd already decided that it was probably her fault in his eyes that he was in this unhappy situation, unhappy at school, unhappy at home, and the divorce was her fault. And therefore, having made that decision to kill her, to murder her, he was just then looking for a modus operandi, a technique, how to do it. And that's probably where the Coronation Street angle came in.
Daniel Bartlam was looking online at the Coronation Street killing where a character called John Stape killed somebody with a hammer. He was absolutely obsessed with him.
Troubled, angry, and crippled with emotional pain, it was Daniel's mum, Jackie, who bore the brunt of his ever more worrying behaviour. She had found a smaller, more affordable house in the Arnold region of Nottingham. Simon helped to pack up Daniel's bedroom.
I found plastic tubs, you know, these carry crates you have with toys in. They were full, when you lifted them, full of urine. Not new, been there for quite some time. Obviously, I found he defecated all over his room and hidden towels, you know.
What do you mean, like all over his room?
Well, he'd gone to the toilet and wiped himself and hidden the towels under the bed, where you wouldn't necessarily see unless you were cleaning the room out.
What was your first impression when you saw that?
I was horrified. That's when I started thinking, something not quite right here.
Simon soon made another disturbing discovery.
I found a laptop bag full of Jackie's underwear, which I mentioned to Jackie, and again I was like, oh, it's getting a bit much now, and then literally Jackie said I was looking for them, didn't know where they'd gone. There's no sort of telling him off for doing it. She asked him, that was it. I think Jackie didn't want to fuss. I think she just wanted an easy life, rather than all this hassle about, you know. So I think she realised later that it wasn't a fuss, it was quite serious.
What do you mean when you say easy life? Because it's used so flippantly in today's society.
Well, I don't think she wanted the hassle of the arguments with Daniel, because he was constant, he was quite draining on everybody. Especially when he was with his mum, he was quite draining to be around him, because he was quite demanding, even though he went in his room. You know, everything he did was quite strange.
What's your understanding of again, why he would have stole things and taken his mother's underwear and hid them in bags?
Again, this is another thing that people have analysed really in a lot of detail and tried to say that there was some kind of sexual element to it. I don't think there was at all. It was, again, to elicit a reaction, to have somebody really worried about this incredibly disturbing behaviour. People like Daniel, the world for them is kind of an experiment, and they will push people's buttons and see what happens. What happens if I do this? What reaction will I get if I do that? And they're constantly storing up this body of knowledge about other people's emotions and about what's the appropriate and inappropriate way to act.
Daniel's disturbing behaviour was also concerning his teachers. They sent him to see the school counsellor after he claimed that his tie had a life of its own and was trying to kill him.
So what they were looking for was what we call psychotic episodes, people hearing voices or having strange thoughts. And this was because he said that his tie was trying to strangle him, and he called his tie Fred. And of course, what they were looking for was psychotism and psychotic episodes and psychotic thinking, rather than straightforward anxiety and depression.
Did he have psychiatric problems?
He had psychiatric assessments, which, from what I understand, came back clear. But I don't see how somebody can do what he did without having some sort of psychiatric problem.
I find his case really hard to understand the motive. Even if he was a psychopath, he's not getting any kudos from it. He's not getting status. He's not getting possessions from it. I don't understand his motivation. I'm worried about his reports of hearing voices, about his peculiar behaviour, defecating in his room. I'd want to know more what's going on there. He's a troubling case. There doesn't seem to be remorse, but there seems to be a whole lot else that's going on, and doesn't exactly fit to me a typical pattern of psychopathic individual.
Nobody I've spoken to is 100% sure that Daniel had any mental illness. But the one thing we do know for sure is that he was a very angry boy.
The degree of planning that he exhibited, the story on the computer, the staging, the setting fire to cover his tracks, and the way that he stuck to his guns for weeks afterwards, it demonstrates a determination, a resilience that's perhaps more characteristic of a hardened criminal and not a 14-year-old who's committed his first serious offence.
And with his cries for help unanswered, the next step he took was a deadly one. By Easter 2011, Daniel Bartlam's relationship with his mother Jackie had reached an all-time low. The 14-year-old was demonstrating increasingly rebellious and disturbing behaviour at school and in their Nottingham home. He was obsessed with violent films and focused much of his anger towards his mum.
We don't know why, whether it was revenge for ruining his life or whether he blamed her for the divorce. We have no idea why she was the target for his unhappiness. But we know that the murder of his mother was premeditated and planned. And where he got those plans from was the media.
In the early hours of the morning of Tuesday, the 26th of April 2011, the Bartlams' neighbours awoke to a house fire.
I was paged about 7:30 in the morning, I think, and control basically just said to me, can you attend the nearest police station for 9 o'clock, where we were going to have a briefing, and then the fire investigation team were going to go down to the scene. So probably arrived at the scene itself by about 11 o'clock. The police had cordoned off quite a large area around the estate, but obviously there was a lot of press interest. So we had to sort of go through the gauntlet of all the press and the cameras and everything.
The first we were informed about it was that there'd been a fire in Georgia Drive in Arnold, and we had reporters on the scene. There were neighbours outside the houses wondering what had happened, and we learned from speaking to them that the little boy that lived there and his brother had come out of the house with the dog, and that a lady inside had died. You could see from the outside that there was severe smoke damage to one of the windows. Something terrible had happened in there.
The actual atmosphere itself is quite surreal in some ways. It's an unnatural, eerie silence. We're there as a professional team, we have a professional job to do, but you can't help thinking this is somebody's home, this was where somebody lived, right up until the point of the fire. Once we'd actually got the area of origin into the room itself, what we would then do is try and narrow down, try and work back as close as we could. In this particular instance, we came to the conclusion quite early on that the seat of the fire itself was on or around the actual body, which was lying on the floor.
The badly burned body of Jackie Bartlam was recovered and taken for a post-mortem. Her partner Simon rushed back to Nottingham from Yorkshire, where he'd been working.
Later on that day again, going into the evening time, obviously then got told a body had been found in the fire. And once I'd heard that, all I knew was that, in my own mind, it had something to do with Daniel. I didn't for 1 minute think that he'd done what he'd done.
What are you feeling at that moment?
You just sort of get transported into this place where you don't know, you can't believe what's going on. All I knew was Jackie was dead and there'd been a fire, but I didn't know, obviously, the other bits regarding what he'd actually done.
Daniel's initial account was that he'd got up in the middle of the night to use the toilet. He'd found himself confronted with a masked man who'd thrown a hammer at him and fled. And he then saw that his mother had been attacked in her bedroom and that the bedroom was on fire. And he panicked, and that he left the house with his younger brother and the dog, but that his mother was inside as the house burnt.
Lies, you know, it's all lies.
What are you thinking?
Well, I'm putting together it's lies that that's what happened, as in there wasn't an intruder, there never was an intruder, and it was Daniel that actually done this. I'm thinking it's all sort of coming together now, it's all clicking into place. You know, all his previous behaviours, everything's clicking into place.
And I think it was a relatively short time, you know, just a matter of a few hours in this particular case, when the officers that were dealing started to think, well, you know, things aren't adding up here, and we're not absolutely sure that he's telling us exactly what happened.
Did he ever feel anything for his mum?
Yeah, I'd find it difficult to pinpoint a stage where he did feel that kind of closeness. It probably would have been in his very, very early years, but it's always been about him. For as long as he's been able to make decisions and to influence people, it's been about him.
So why save the brother?
Well, I think that the reason that he saved the brother was because he wanted to create that narrative of this person's come into the house and they've targeted my mother. And look, I'm the hero, because it paints him in a good light, doesn't it? If he rescues the brother, he rescues the dog. Daniel has saved the day. He's basically achieved two things. He's removed his mother from the equation, and at the same time, he's got everybody thinking how great he is because he's gone in there the hero.
Just 2 days after the tragic house fire on Georgia Drive, the police arrested Daniel on suspicion of murdering Jackie, his own mother.
I didn't know the facts of how she was killed. But sadly, and I still feel this, I wasn't surprised that Daniel had been involved. I wasn't surprised at all. It was something that I was expecting to hear, but obviously not to the point of what I later found out, but I wasn't surprised.
Forensic searches of the home unearthed not one, but 2 hammers at the crime scene.
There was one hammer which was a claw hammer, which examination of Jackie's body proved was the murder weapon, but there was also a kind of a club hammer that it transpired that Daniel had thrown in there to sort of be a red herring, if you like, or to be a supposed murder weapon.
He's very typical of a lot of murderers that carry out a premeditated homicide like this, in that he hasn't thought about the clear-up afterwards. He's given some consideration to it, but I think he's so arrogant and he's so sure of himself at this point in time that, you know, the details towards the end of the story, well, they'll just work themselves out. I honestly think that's the way that he looked at it.
He really just looked at himself as thinking that he was going to get away with this.
Well, I think that he was under the impression nobody's ever going to imagine that I would kill my own mother.
But there was one particularly damning piece of evidence found in Daniel's bedroom, which made it all too easy to believe he was capable of murder.
Daniel Bartlam wrote a script in which he was the central character, and he killed his mother, and he set fire to the body, and he made it look like an intruder had killed her. Police found that on his computer. He deleted it, so he thought that nobody would know that he'd actually thought about killing his own mother. And what was something that was a work of fiction became reality.
You wrote stories about him being the most famous soap star ever and being in the soap for 50 years, and Daniel Bartlam, his longest running soap star, famous this, famous that. So I think he wanted to be famous, notoriously famous, but I don't think anyone could have actually predicted that this is what he would do.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing I find most difficult to deal with, the fact that he planned it.
After denying it for weeks, Daniel, faced with the new evidence against him, admitted to killing his mum and told the police an entirely different version of events.
On the day of the murder, Daniel had argued with his mother earlier in the day. She'd gone to bed. About 1 a.m, he storms into her bedroom and they have a flaming argument about some trainers, some new trainers he can't find. As a result of that, he's taken a hammer, he's hit her about the head multiple times, many times, fracturing both her skull and her face. He's then set the fire in the room and disappeared out of the house with his brother and the dog.
I've been doing this job since 2004. I've investigated well over 50 to 100 deliberate fires where we've had somebody die, so in effect a murder. This is the only one I can recall that actually involved a teenage suspect. For me, it was quite surprising. You've got such a young child that was capable of committing such a crime.
A lot of red flags, right? A lot of red flags. I've got to ask you, do you think this could have been prevented?
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
Daniel had scripted the whole thing. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment reaction or a fit of rage. This was a planned murder. But why on earth would a 14-year-old boy want to carry out such a calculated killing?
People who have psychopathic traits, it's as if they don't have the brake. They don't have a brake on their behavior, because when you and I see distress, it puts a brake on, we stop. But it isn't in itself a motive to do harm. People who are psychopaths just don't stop from doing harm. This case, killing his mother, to me is completely mysterious and without motive.
Can children be psychopaths?
It's a really difficult question because, of course, a child is still developing and you don't want to say anything set in stone with a child. But it's clear that adults who have lots of psychopathic traits typically showed those even when they were much younger. And there are children who are callous and unemotional and don't show remorse, just like those adult psychopaths.
Has Daniel got the intelligence to know the difference between reality and fantasy?
A lot of people have said to me about this case, well, surely this young lad didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know the difference between right and wrong, fact and fiction. Of course he did. It's been proven that he was not suffering from any mental illness. He knew what he was doing. He knew what he was doing was wrong, but he chose to do it anyway.
The 14-year-old boy now had to await his trial. Daniel was going to plead not guilty.
This was an unprecedented case. It's the first case of its kind where I've certainly covered a child murderer at that age, and the sheer brutality of it, savage killing of his own mother, the woman that brought him into the world, the fact that he was capable of doing that is tragic.
If the prosecution couldn't prove that Daniel had killed Jackie on purpose, he was going to get away with murder. On the 4th of October 2011, Daniel Bartlam pleaded not guilty to the murder of his mother, Jackie. Despite having bludgeoned her to death with a hammer, the 14-year-old claimed that he had been provoked. His trial began on January the 23rd, 2012.
I have covered hundreds of cases, Nottingham Crown Court, and I have never had a young boy of that age charged with such a horrific crime. It was senseless killing, and to write about it, although you remain composed, you can't help but be affected by what he did.
And it was quite draining, really, the whole thing, because you've got this kid up on the dock who's 14, and he's on trial for murder. He's not this big, streetwise thug, gangster sort of type. Just a normal kid that you'd see on the street. You wouldn't look at him twice. He's just a normal looking, somewhat, I suppose, geeky child.
It was shocking, I think, for everybody concerned that this young boy who sat very meekly in the dock, who then, when gave evidence, became quite arrogant when he was cross-examined by the prosecution. There were no flies on him. He gave as good as he got, but on first impressions in the dock, he just looked like this young, helpless boy that was completely out of his depth.
Why stick to the story in the trial? Why not say, yes, I did it? Why deny it?
Well, I think because he's still got that arrogance, he still thinks that he could potentially get away with it. So he's just sticking rigidly to the story. It's like the child that's done something naughty. Did you eat that cookie? Mouth covered in chocolate? No. And until you confront them with the evidence, then they're going to stick to that. And I think that's the case here.
Did he look at you?
Went like that to me towards the end of the trial, which I didn't find intimidating. I just found it to be him, Daniel being Daniel, probably being defiant, thinking he was, could do what he wants again. He would look down a lot. He would put his head in his hands a lot, but not because he was remorseful for what he did. His head was in his hands, but peeping through, like you'd do with a little kid, Make a face at them around the back of your hands and they'd make them laugh. He was head down, but then trying to look through to see who was watching him. All, in my opinion, it was all for show. No remorse, no crying, no nothing. It was just, can't be bothered with this sort of thing.
After 2 weeks, the jury reached a decision. Daniel was guilty.
So when the jury came back with the verdict, Daniel Bartlam hung his head and looked like he was about to cry. He put his head in his hands. And at that moment, I think he realised that his life was effectively over.
On April the 2nd, 2012, Daniel was sentenced to life imprisonment. He'll serve a minimum of 16 years. But this so-called devil child could be out before he's 30, with most of his life ahead of him.
Can you explain what the journey would be from being sentenced there in court and where he would end up?
Very often these sorts of children go straight into a young offender institution run by the prison service, staffed by prison officers, and the children spend the majority of their time in their cells. Their education is scant, and the ability to access psychological, psychiatric support is virtually impossible.
I think about him, for example, in a men's prison, because presumably that's where he is now. I just wonder how he would survive in that prison. What his,
Concerned?
No. If someone were to tell me tomorrow something had happened to him in prison, I wouldn't be concerned about his welfare. It's just so many unanswered questions. It might be a bit two-faced, really, but it's just, maybe it's the not knowing where he is or not knowing how he's getting on. Maybe it's that.
How does somebody like Daniel cope in that circumstance, that transition?
I imagine that he will cope very badly. He is likely to be bullied, victimised, and he'll retreat into a shell, and he'll have to survive, or he won't survive.
Daniel will be eligible for release in 2028. But it won't happen if he's judged to still be a danger to others.
Malcolm, the question is, can someone like Daniel be rehabilitated? And if so, how?
Well, I can answer the question confidently, yes, they can, because there are plenty of examples of children who have committed, not necessarily matricide, but high-profile cases like that. Are they dangerous? Yes. And have they been rehabilitated? Yes. And by that I mean, have they been released satisfactorily, got a job, had a family, and settled down, and no one's ever heard of them again? Yes, there have been plenty of examples of that. So, in principle, the answer is yes. In his case, because it's hypothetical, what you would have to do is to work with him and educate him and attend to whatever special needs there are and whatever factors there are which contributed to the commission of that offence.
I don't see how somebody who could plan that at that age so well, if you like, could or should be allowed out again.
Yeah.
And that's not because I want to see him rot for the rest of his life. I just don't believe, personally, that anyone who's done that should be allowed to be rehabilitated.
And in the case of Daniel Bartlam, would you say that he was a victim of nature or nurture?
So they're, as far as we know, a pretty loving family. Of course, marriage splitting up, but that's not unusual. So there's not a lot of nurture that we can see being a problem there. I think that I'm worried about psychotic experiences there. I'm worried about something that probably is more genetic, but obviously without knowing the individual, hard to tell.
Yes.
I think it's a combination of both. I think that Daniel is somebody who probably came into the world with particular traits, with particular tendencies, but I think he's been in an environment where they haven't been suppressed, they've not been challenged, they've not been confronted, and unfortunately, you've got the perfect storm.
You just go through each day and you just try and piece the facts together yourself, and unfortunately you make your own, fill your own blanks in sometimes.
That was something you did until you got the facts?
Still do, because obviously nobody can know the real facts. There's only one person alive that can really fill in the blanks of what actually happened that night, isn't there? He's not going to tell her, he's not told anyone to this day what exactly happened that night. We only know what's been assumed and what's been pieced together.
Do you love Daniel?
No. Don't hate him either.
You don't love him, you don't hate him. What is it you feel?
Nothing. Just non-existent. Got no feelings for him at all. I don't know if I ever did have any feelings for him. I don't honestly think I ever loved Daniel. I didn't dislike him, but it's a fine line, isn't it? I don't hate him. Just nothing doesn't exist to me, really.
Do you think his mother, if she was here today, could forgive him?
I can't answer that for Jackie. I can't answer that. I believe in forgiveness. But there's some things you can forgive and some things you can't.
Daniel Bartlam was just 14 years old when he murdered his mother in cold blood. There was no doubt it was a calculated decision, even though it was made by an immature boy. As to why he did it, well, only one person knows the answer to that question: Daniel.